Bigfoot was reported going through a dumpster. 8 to 9 foot tall humanoid creature with tan, wrinkly leather skin. I don't know what they mean, but they were appearing where this guy had a dramatic Bigfoot encounter. My name is Steve Berg. I am an actor and comedian, but more importantly, I have been wildly fascinated with the strange and unusual since I was a little kid for some reason. I'm not exactly sure why, but probably like many kids, I had the Time Life book series that had, a book about UFOs, a book about lake monsters, a book about Bigfoot and other cryptids. And I just fell in love with all of it. And it's one of those passions that I think even as a kid, I kind of thought I'd grow out of it, but my love for all this stuff has only intensified. So, yeah, I'm just kind of a lifer in the paranormal and ufological and cryptid world, and I just love it all. And I kind of maybe have somewhat of a unique look on this stuff where I'm not exactly convinced that they're all separate things. I kind of think there are aspects of all these things that kind of bleed into each other that I find very interesting.
Well, I do too. I find it fascinating, and it's hard to say because we really don't know exactly what we're dealing with.
Absolutely.
Obviously something. So tell me, have you ever had a Bigfoot encounter?
No, no, I wish. And I'm a avid lover of the outdoors, and so I've spent a lot of time outdoors. I you know go to places where Bigfoot has been reported, but I myself have never brushed across any physical evidence or seen a flash of something I couldn't explain in the woods. No, it's for me, unfortunately, it's been very mundane. So yeah, I have not had a cryptid encounter of any kind or a Bigfoot encounter, but I'm holding out hope, sister.
I understand. Well, I haven't either. So, I'm doing all of these interviews and I'm getting everything secondhand, but some
Hmm.
really fascinating stories out there about Bigfoot and other cryptids as well. And I'm sure you've run across some of those as well yourself. So tell me about anything that you've heard about.
Yeah, well, I guess I have sort of, taken a page out of John Keel's book and sort of kind of like made Eastern Nebraska where I live kind of my little microcosm that I try to look at. Because I kind of feel I'm interested in, things that happen everywhere, certainly, and read books about it. I love it. But in terms of my own research, I kind of try to focus it down to Eastern Nebraska stories. So it's one of those things where I feel like, when people who are interested in Bigfoot hear about Bigfoot reports in Nebraska, they're like, oh, come on, give me a break. It's all cornfields, flat, and they're right. It is not a heavily forested state. But on Eastern Nebraska, going all from the very tippy top of northern Nebraska all the way down to South Nebraska, right along the eastern side along the Missouri River, there has been Bigfoot reports going back to the late 1800s. Before they had the term Bigfoot, they just called a large, hairy, wild man. But there are definitely reports. In fact, I just took a report and went out and I guess investigated this area where Bigfoot was supposedly seen last week in Blair, Nebraska. So it is historically active, and if obviously with like you said, these are stories in secondhand, so I can't prove any kind of with any evidence or the validity of any of these cases. But there is recent reports, there's old reports. So along eastern Nebraska is where really you will find most of the Bigfoot stuff. And now it has popped up all over the state, but I found the biggest concentration of Bigfoot and kind of high strangeness in general right along eastern Nebraska. So, for instance,
You think it's
um,
the river? You think the river has anything to do with that?
I think it could be a multitude of things. You do find UFO encounters, UFO sightings, Bigfoot sightings, and a lot of high strangeness close to bodies of water. And maybe there's something with the mighty Missouri River is a very big, powerful river. And also, the state of Nebraska is the second most miles of river going through it. There's tons of rivers here. But I do wonder if there is a correlation between the river. Now, I will say the boring answer to that is where there are rivers, usually that's the highest population. Because, back in the day, they would create cities and towns around rivers so they could import and export things. So part of me is like, well, maybe it's the river has something to do with it and kind of the wooded areas. But I guess if you were looking at it like logically and not with the Bigfoot mind, you could maybe say, well, it's also where the highest population by far in the state of Nebraska is right along the Missouri River. So I don't really know. I want to have, a kind of cool paranormal way to look at. But I guess if I'm being honest with myself, I would say probably because the most people live close to the river, to be honest.
Well, I can understand that. But someone just last week had some form of a Bigfoot sighting. Can you tell me about that? Do you know enough about it to give me any
I
information?
can. It's kind of really a fresh case. So I learned about it last Thursday night, and weirdly enough, kind of in a synchronistic fashion, I was going out to a place called Oakland, Nebraska, where they were for one summer back in 1974, they were kind of inundated with Bigfoot sightings and fairly dramatic ones. So I was going out there to take pictures of Oakland, Nebraska. But the night before, like right before I was going to bed, I got a report that from a friend that Bigfoot was seen in Blair, Nebraska, and I just happened to be going in that direction. And I've never even been to Blair, Nebraska, so I thought that was kind of like a funny coincidence or synchronicity, whatever you want to call it. So, what's going on with that is, it's hard to determine exactly when this report or when the people were saying this, but I don't want to name the actual. It was behind. So Bigfoot was reported going through a dumpster, two dumpsters in local businesses in Blair, Nebraska. I've I'm not going to name. I know of one of the locations, one of the businesses, but I'm not going to name it on the air because I talked to the store manager and they do not want this story to come out because they don't want news teams and they don't want a bunch of looky-loos coming rooting around the store. I mean, I'm sure if you look hard enough on the internet, you'll be able to find where it is. But yeah, so people like in a week span were report like two different businesses reported a Bigfoot sighting, and then also someone saw it from the Union Pacific train. Now, the Union Pacific train that goes through Blair, Nebraska is not like a passenger train; it's a freight train. So I believe it was one of the people who were working on the train. I don't know if it was the conductor or the person working at the caboose or anything like that. I don't know that specific, but yeah, someone from the train reportedly saw a Bigfoot, and I guess in 2020, someone from the train supposedly saw a Bigfoot too. So, and that's right along the Missouri River again. It's just, Blair's just a small little nondescript river town. But yeah, that's what's going on right now. And I guess the police have been investigating it.
Well,
So,
that isn't the first time I've heard the dumpster diving scenario. There's a case right here in Missouri that a gentleman found a group, I guess a family, a clan, whatever you want to call it, of
wow.
Bigfoot. And he would often go out and watch them dumpster dive at a small elementary school. And this was a consistent thing he would do. Now, there again, this is secondhand information. It's what
Hmm.
he said, but nonetheless, it is indeed something that supposedly happened. And that's not the only time I've heard of also dumpster diving at state parks, where they
Hmm.
have where their trash is dumped out, and it's often a place that they find they can get easy to access food, human food.
Sure. I mean, it would make sense because I mean, you know, they have bear boxes, at state parks and where you go camping and stuff like that. So I feel like all animals in the wild try to get into like state park trash or trash if they have access because it is a food source. It smells good to them probably. So if Bigfoot is a flesh and blood animal, yeah, it would. I feel like it would make perfect sense that they would go try to get some easy calories from a dumpster.
Yeah, and I've heard they really like our food. They like the salty, fatty, whatever it is
Yeah,
that humans eat. Our junk food.
yeah. Well, look, we do a lot of things wrong as humans, but I think we get food right. We make delicious food, don't we?
We have. I don't know how healthy it is, but it's definitely delicious. So
That's
I'll agree
true.
with
Very
that.
true.
For
Yep.
sure, for sure. So you've not only been interested in Bigfoot, and we'll get back to Bigfoot, but what
Mhm.
other cryptids are you also interested in?
Well, gosh, I have a fondness for all of them to be honest, but I guess one kind of form of cryptid that I love is the flying winged humanoid. So in Nebraska, we have kind of a fantastic we have a few flying wing humanoid cases, but that I know of. But there's one that's kind of fairly well known. John Keel and Jacques Vallée both wrote about it in their books, and it was in 1957 in Falls City, Nebraska. There was a man named Mr. Hanks, which is a pseudonym. He was driving back into the tiny little town of Falls City, and he sees what looks like a, kind of a very large bird flying in the air. And he's like, that's really weird. So he gets out of his car, and he's right outside of the town at this point to kind of get a better look at, because he was craning his neck out the window and just couldn't get, a good look. So he gets out of his car. Then the thing gets really low, and he kind of notices, like, huh, that kind of looks like a humanoid form, not so much like a bird. Then it swoops around, gets closer, and he notices it's like an 8 to 9 foot tall humanoid creature with tan, wrinkly leather skin, piercing blue eyes. And instead of like how the traditional flying wing humanoid or the Mothman per se, it isn't, the wings are not organic. This creature, whatever it is, this entity is wearing like a shoulder harness with wings strapped to his shoulders. And then in the middle of his chest, he has like what looks like almost like a computer like circuit board, and which has knobs, and this creature is twisting the knobs, almost trying to course correct itself, because it's wobbling a lot in the air and having problems flying. And Mr. Hanks becomes paralyzed once this thing gets close. And it starts wobbling close to the ground, and he can see it fully. To him, he said it looked like a flying demon with a shoulder or with a flying wing apparatus on its shoulders. And then finally, it gets really low, twists a couple more knobs, course corrects itself, and flies off. But this man, Mr. Hanks, was so deeply traumatized by this event that he said his whole life goal, the rest of his life, was to not sleep, because whenever he closed his eyes, he saw this creature. And so he ended up taking like a night job just so he could avoid sleeping. And it really like impacted his life in not such a great way. But I do love cases like that, because I guess I'm really attracted to the stories that are super like surreal and high strange and just kind of defy normal logic in how we humans would operate in a day to day. I think there's really something to the weird part of all these encounters that we should be paying attention to. And that kind of flying wing humanoid case just kind of like ticks all the boxes of what I love in a story.
Well, with Bigfoot, of course, there's the two camps. One is that they're just flesh and blood creatures out there in the woods,
Mhm.
like, we just haven't discovered them yet. And the
Right.
other is that there's some kind of a real paranormal kind of quality to them, and they,
Yep.
come and go out of portals or UFOs or things like
Right.
that. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I obviously I don't know. So this is just my best speculation. I do, I guess, find it really hard to kind of buy and believe that if it's a flesh and blood creature that we have not found, one, a body, two, we wouldn't have seen it a lot more, and three, I mean, there is historical accounts of it, but they're very few and far between. And also, I can't get past the notion that there's nothing in the fossil record, because we find dinosaurs and woolly mammoths that are millions of years old, but we haven't found a Bigfoot yet. So I guess, people will say, well, they bury their own and stuff. But even if it's buried, I mean, I feel like we would find it, because we find all kinds of like very ancient bones and fossil records. So, I'm never shutting the door on anything. I'm skeptical, but I'm always like, radically open-minded with all this stuff. I think you need to be skeptical, like when you're looking into this stuff. You can't just like believe everything whole cloth, because none of us know for sure, I think. But yeah, at this point, I kind of have like at least put the flesh and blood, nuts and bolts Bigfoot idea kind of to the side and focus more on a lot of the symptoms that people have when they have a encounter with Bigfoot, such as the orbs of light, and people talk about mind speak a lot, or getting zapped and being confused. These all sound more poltergeist-like to me and paranormal. Like, I guess, if you see an orb of light in the sky, people call it a UFO. If you see an orb of light in someone's house, they call it a ghost. And if they see it, in a forest, I think it's kind of maybe perhaps symptomatic of a Bigfoot sighting. So I don't know what any of that means. I know this is a confusing way to answer the question, but I feel that a lot of these Bigfoot reports, and I've talk to people who are part of like the BFRO and stuff, and a lot of times they leave these weird details out of the reports, and probably in an effort to make it more, for science to take it more seriously or to legitimize it. But I'm not worried about any of that. I'm not worried about proving this stuff to anyone. I'm not a scientist. So I feel like we shouldn't ignore the weirder aspects to Bigfoot. And I feel like a guy like Stan Gordon, who is one of my favorite writers on Bigfoot, he's really hammered that point home and been courageous enough to not leave out a lot of these weirder details in these accounts. And so I like to do comparative analysis. Like, what's the commonality between all these weird things? UFOs, just the paranormal in general, and cryptids. And what you find, at least I have found, there's a lot of similarities to these accounts, So I guess right now, the idea that's most compelling to me is that perhaps Bigfoot and cryptids are something a little more high strange than nuts and bolts.
So going back to the reports from Nebraska,
Mm-hmm.
do you have any idea approximately how many reports of seeing a Bigfoot has happened there?
Oh, well, okay. So I think if, just going off like the BFRO, like, which is kind of the MUFON of the Bigfoot world, I think there is roughly a dozen reports. But if you take it, I mean, like, it's hard to determine because I talk to so many people and they have reports I've never heard of. I have reports other people haven't heard of because I go through old newspapers like crazy. That's one of my hobbies. I have a membership to newspapers.com, and I would recommend all researchers to invest in that because while you can find a lot of stuff on Google, you can find more in newspapers.com if you're patient. So to give you an estimate, I would be just I mean, I don't know, quite a bit, like it's, I don't think we get as many as Washington, Oregon, Ohio, Pennsylvania, or anything like that. But there's quite a few, especially like when I go to the Nebraska Bigfoot conference, all I'm doing is hearing Bigfoot reports from people there. Now, again, they're just stories. But to me, the stories are important because you can find patterns. You can kind of suss out whether a lot of times I think when you're in this stuff long enough, you can kind of tell a little bit if at least if these people believe what they're saying to you. Because I've talked to some people that I can tell that they want something out of telling me this story. And immediately I'm kind of like, I don't know, it's a little suspect. But there are people who will come up to me and they seem traumatized or whatever they encountered changed them. And I can just feel like, hey, at the very least, I believe that they believe what they're telling me. That's all I can really determine. So when I give a rough estimate, I mean, I could say 50 cases, but it could be 1,000. I just don't know.
Yeah, it's really hard to say because so many people, not only are they traumatized by it potentially, but also they're afraid of ridicule
Yeah,
and that
of
they won't
course.
be believed. And
Yeah.
so that keeps people quiet as well. Have you
Mhm.
run into those people as well?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, a lot of like, some of the create like more dramatic Bigfoot encounters, people like I'm telling you this, don't use my name. I don't want anything out of this. I don't want you to talk about this in your podcast. And I always honor those wishes because I will tell you right now, if I had a Bigfoot experience, I don't think I'd be afraid to talk about it with someone like you, but I certainly wouldn't go report it, take the time to report it to BFRO or anyone else because to me, like with the UFO experience, with Bigfoot experience, I think a lot of this is personal. And I almost even wonder if like part of us is like, if you think about Carl Jung, he always talks about we're swimming in a sea of archetypes. And I feel like Bigfoot is almost like this kind of like American folk hero kind of archetype now. I mean, I see Bigfoot stickers in Omaha, Nebraska everywhere. I didn't see that, 10 years ago. And Bigfoot's really having this moment. So whether Bigfoot is just like this folklore that goes way back, I don't know. I don't know if this is all mythology or if it's real, or I don't even know if mythology can become real or folklore can become real if enough people believe in it. I'm really open to all these ideas. And I know a lot of this sounds very woo-woo, but I guess willing to go, and entertain a lot of these woo-woo ideas because we simply don't know. So I just feel that like staying very open-minded and never being certain about any of this stuff is a great way to always learn and be able to ask better questions. Because not to be cynical, but I do not think we'll ever know what UFOs are or represent. And maybe the same goes for cryptids. I just don't see a day coming where we're like, we figured out Bigfoot. Like I feel like we would have had that a long time ago. So, I that's not important to me. The mystery and the stories are important to me. So I feel like I kind of like gave up on getting answers to any of this stuff a while ago.
Well, I can understand. I've been a UFO researcher since the 90s. And
Hmm.
after a while, you realize, it's always just an uphill battle to
Yeah.
find much of anything. But also, Bigfoot has that same impact. I only got involved with Bigfoot interviews a year ago and really knew very
Hmm.
little about Bigfoot. But like you, I've seen some major similarities. And what
Yeah.
keeps people going is really the mystery that
Yes.
we don't have those answers, and keeps people looking for things. But a lot of people who have an encounter with Bigfoot, they also want some validation. And I
Yeah.
think for them to prove that this thing is a flesh and blood thing out there, is just very, very important to them. So
Hmm.
they are looking to have some kind of scientific evidence or some further
Right.
thing that enables them to validate it. But a point that you made is, if we look at something, which is a very metaphysical idea, if
Hmm.
we think of something enough, if we look at something enough, that maybe we actually manifest that into a physical being. Tell me
Yeah.
about that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think the term that Carl Jung, who was a great, made great advancements in, psychotherapy and psychology and, kind of took Joseph Campbell's work a step further and, really talking about the archetypes. The way he saw UFOs, he said that, and I'm going to paraphrase here, it's much more complex the way he talks about it, but like basically he thought UFOs were real. He thought they were mostly an immaterial object, but could manifest itself in a material way, meaning that like it's not necessarily a hunk of metal flying through the sky, but it can leave physical traces. And if you think about that, same with the paranormal. I mean, paranormal investigators and ghost investigators used to put talcum powder down on the ground when they thought like a ghost was in the house, and they would find footprints. So that, and like, I feel like like the way most people think of apparitions is it's a non-physical um entity that you can see with your own eyes, but it's not like solid and not made of material. And I think UFOs very well might be a projection, because if you think about it, it's like there's been, I mean, I'm just guessing, obviously, thousands of different kinds of craft seen, thousands of different kinds of entities seen, and it changes throughout time. In the late 1800s, people saw flying airships. In the 1940s, people saw flying saucers. In the 1980s, people started seeing triangular shaped craft, and then it went to orange orbs, and now it's Tic Tacs. So whatever this is, it's I feel like it is evolving with us as we get more technologically advanced. And I wonder, is the UFO phenomenon about ready to change? Who knows? Like, so with all this stuff, I just feel like you need to be radically open-minded and extremely skeptical I mean, I'm very skeptical of like the whole disclosure movement with UFOs. Like I am not one of those people who's like waiting around for the government to confirm the existence of UFOs and UFO occupants. I don't think that's ever going to come from them. So that's not something I put a whole lot of like attention and stock into. But it's really people's stories that are important to me, because when you collect enough stories, you can kind of find similarities and patterns and how the encounter affected them. And I feel like those kinds of answers are what we can do, is collect stories, find patterns. Maybe it's certain locations. Maybe there's something geographically going on where, like it is, maybe it's always by rivers or lakes or something like that. So yeah, I don't know if I was answering your question. I think I might have tangentialized
Yeah,
on.
no, I think you did well.
Okay.
Let's go back to Nebraska, because I'm
Hmm.
really curious. I do a lot of interviews, and we kind of focus on a state and
Right.
what's happening with
Awesome.
Bigfoot in that state.
Right.
So you've told me a couple of things. Are there any other cases there that you think are relevant or have any kind of information that would be valuable to my listeners?
Yeah, I do. There is a case that I love, and a lot of what I do is I'm and I wish I had time to go roam around the forest and the cornfields at night, but I don't. And I don't have a whole lot of desire to do that. It sounds scary to me. But what I like to do is kind of find these cases that sound good to me, that intrigue me, and I like to really cold case dive on them. So there was a case in 2014 where a 15-year-old kid and his father, the kid was driving and the dad was taking him to driver's ed at about 5:30 in the morning, kind of when it was starting to get light out. And I mean, it was light out, but it was like, kind of that like a in between liminal time of light and dark was coming up. And they're driving on a country road, and as they're driving, this I think it was they said it was 7 foot tall, you know, Bigfoot like creature runs across the road and then just goes into a creek. And so it was a really great report. There's more to it. I'm just kind of paraphrasing it, but the interesting thing is to me is that when I followed up, I actually so this is an article that was kind of like all over Nebraska, like Omaha and Lincoln, kind of the bigger cities covered it. And what I noticed right away is the two witnesses did not want their names out there. They wanted nothing out of this. And to me, that always intrigues me. When people have these sightings and they do not want any notoriety or fame or to be in a podcast or to get followers on their Instagram, immediately I start to take the case a little more seriously. And maybe that's probably just my own bias, but that is how uh, I guess I just how I operate. Anyway, in the article, the original article in the story about this, the sheriff of Butler County and the commissioner of or the game warden commissioner of Eastern Nebraska investigated this. So they thought it was worthwhile to investigate. So I actually called the sheriff, and the sheriff told me this. He was like, I'll kind of, paraphrase again, but he was like, look, I've known the father and the son. I grew up with them. I went to high school with the father, and I know the son. The son is an honor roll student. The dad is, I've known him my whole life. He's not somebody to make this stuff up. And so the sheriff told me this. He's like, look, we've had other sightings of Bigfoot around here. Do I think they saw Bigfoot? I couldn't tell you, but I will tell you this right now. They're not lying. They saw something and they think, like, whatever they saw, I know they believe what they saw. They simply weren't making it up. And I talked to the game warden commissioner, and he said kind of the same thing. He's like, look, I talked to the witnesses. They truly don't want their names out there. They don't want anything out of this. And they were freaked out. Like it kind of it messed with them. And the game warden commissioner was like, look, we couldn't really find any footprints or hair or anything like that. But he's like, I actually do get reports from the same area. And this is in Linwood, Nebraska, which is a tiny village of, I think, like under 100 people. And it butts up against kind of like a very thick tree line. And it's just really, I mean, in Nebraska, I don't know if you've ever been here. It's like there's Omaha and Lincoln, and in between Omaha and Lincoln, it is really just a rural state. It's a big state. There's tiny little towns, but like there would be plenty of area for something to roam undetected, potentially, if it's a flesh and blood creature. But that case I love because I was kind of able to go back and talk to the sheriff and talk to the game warden commissioner. And I visited the site multiple times, and I even went to there in the town, there's the only business is a steakhouse. And I went to the steakhouse and talk to the owner because I was like, well, where do people congregate in this little town? How can I talk to people? And the owner of the restaurant was like, look, if you come in on a Saturday, 2/3 of the population of this town is there eating lunch. And if you come, I'll introduce you to some people. So I went and he did. And people have these Bigfoot stories. And a lot of people there really think there's something to it. So, and at a certain point, you kind of hit a dead end with these cold case stories. But that was one I was able to take pretty far down the road and glean some new information. And I thought it was very, compelling that the sheriff, who is not, I talked, he was a very grounded guy, and he was really clear and saying, like, look, I'm not saying I believe in Bigfoot, but they saw something. And the reality is, like, it's Nebraska. We do not have black bear or grizzly bear here. We have cougar sightings, but I can't really imagine someone mistaking a cougar for a Bigfoot or a deer We just don't have that many big mammals roaming around Nebraska. So if people say they saw this and they're telling the truth, I mean, like, I feel like there's something genuine to it. What they saw, obviously, we'll never know. But yeah, that's a case I just really love because one, it's an area where people have reported seeing Bigfoot for a long time, and two, that these people just wanted nothing to it. And I've tried to reach out through other channels to try to get them to talk to me, but they want no part of it. They really don't. They just want to forget about it.
I understand. Given that you do have some information about Nebraska Bigfoot sightings,
Mm-hmm.
is there any kind of correlation that you can make between these sightings as to what they look like, size, coloring, any distinctive
Yeah.
marks that would set them in conjunction with other places, or maybe even different than other places?
God, it's a great question. I mean, just thinking right now, I can think of three types. What there is a bow hunter that I have been working with who had a dramatic Bigfoot encounter that really messed him up. He stopped hunting for 2 years and now doesn't even bow hunt. He just goes out with a gun because it really messed him up and kind of like 180'd his life. But he saw what he thought was a all black figure, black fur with a conical head, kind of that classic conical head. But the case I was just talking before, it was red hair. And same with the case in Blair, Nebraska, that is, just happened last week. That the I actually talked to the witness who saw it, and she said it had red hair. Now, also in Chadron, Nebraska, there's a great case where a group of professors were hiking in Chadron State Park, and they observed a 7 foot tall creature on a cliff. Like not when I say a cliff, it was like a big cliff on a mountain. We don't have mountains, but it was like across from the trailhead from them, probably like 100 yards, and they saw it was like a white looking creature, grayish white. So we kind of, that's three different kinds of, I guess, coloring that I've discovered. But yeah, no, it does. There doesn't seem to be anything consistent. Like we're seeing one type of creature. It really has been described in a multitude of ways, different sizes. Like I've heard of like smaller ones. Um, so yeah, I no, there's really no consistency in terms of like what people are seeing.
The one that was seen near the dumpster diving Bigfoot.
Uh-huh.
Was that a small town, or what was that, a larger
Oh
town?
yeah. No, it's tiny. I think Blair, Nebraska is, oh man, it's maybe like 1,500 people. So it is not a big town at all. I mean, you can drive through it in about 2 minutes. It's yeah, it's small. I might be wrong in the population, but yeah, it is. It's a town. It's just a little river town. So kind of nondescript. And yeah, I mean, it happened right at the end of town, kind of off like it's not like a business that was like tucked away where you couldn't see it. No, like if you go through Blair, you'll likely drive by drive by this place. So yeah, no, but yeah, it's not a city. Like Omaha is Omaha is like about 1 million people. So it's kind of your average, big American or bigger American city. But yeah, Blair is just a tiny little town. And that's mostly where the reports I've gotten is smaller towns. It's usually not close to big city areas. Although I will say there has been a number of Bigfoot sightings around Omaha, kind of right outside of Omaha.
I see. So, in your best guess,
Hmm.
where do you think these things come from? What do you think they are? And why do you believe that?
Oh, I mean, I want to be honest and say to be truly honest, I have no idea. Like, when in I'm always careful with the word belief. Like, I think there's something to Bigfoot encrypted, but I can't say like I believe that Bigfoot exists. I really can't. Like, I think people have been seeing a Bigfoot type creature for a long time. I think a lot of the stories probably are not genuine, but I do think a lot of them are, and that's what keeps me interested. But like, I'm not. I guess like with the paranormal and UFOs, it's a little bit difficult for me to operate with in terms of like just having faith that this stuff is real. I do need to see it to like believe it, I think. So, and even if I see it, I don't even know if that's enough for me to believe it because like, your mind can play tricks on you. But I mean, like that being said, though, I don't want to sound like I'm too cynical, but like I think there's something to the UFO phenomenon. I think there's something to the paranormal and to cryptids, but I just don't have a belief system where I think it's this or X or Y. I really have no belief system wrapped up at all with any of this stuff. So I just find it very compelling. I find the stories very compelling, and even if this all this stuff we're talking about, none of it is real. Well, I still think it's very important because whether people like it or not, UFOs and Bigfoot has permeated our culture and has actually been very important to our sociological like culture as a people, as Americans or Europeans or wherever you are. Like folklore, if it's just folklore, well, that's really important too, because look at our media. UFOs are everywhere. There's Bigfoot movies. It's like it's just part of the American folklore and mythology now. And when I say that, I don't want people to think like, oh, you just think it's folklore mythology. That's not really what I'm saying. I'm just saying if that is all it is, well, it's still very important. So no matter what these things are, I think they're massively important and super fascinating. Like if UFOs, we found out somehow none of it is real. It's all like just a collective conscious like hallucination. Well, that's just as interesting to me. So like no matter what, I find these topics interesting. Like whether they're real or not. I tend to lean on the side of there is something genuine with all this stuff, but I just don't know what it is. I would be taking a guess. Like, I guess, like, I was kind of talking about at the beginning, I am more compelled by a high strange idea of Bigfoot simply because I find the flesh and blood, nuts and bolts idea. I mean, maybe it is a flesh and blood thing, but there's just no evidence that is I mean, these Bigfoot prints are interesting, but like I was kind of saying earlier, ghosts can leave imprints in talcum powder. So in UFOs, that I'm not convinced are nuts and bolts like physical objects can leave radiation traces or burn marks or tripod, marking imprints in the ground. So, it is one of these things that's it's just really confusing. And I find all this stuff to be when people have very simple answers, I just like the flesh and blood and the nuts and bolts idea of all this stuff to me is maybe just to me, my opinion, a little too simplistic, where I think this stuff is so complex, so deeply complex, and maybe has something to do more with the nature of reality than it does alien from another planet visiting us or a flesh and blood Bigfoot that we just haven't somehow discovered yet. No dead bodies, no fossil records. So that while these ideas, sometimes when I talk about them or I've talked about them at conferences, some people really dig it, but a lot of people are really like kind of upset about these ideas, maybe because it challenges their belief system. But for me, I'm agnostic to all of it. I'm just always learning. Like last month, I had a different idea about what UFOs represent, and 3 months down the road, I'll have a totally different. I'm constantly evolving in how I look at this stuff.
So bringing you back to some form of the normal evidence that people look at, and of course the footprints you've talked about.
Uh-huh.
A lot of people look at these structures and
Yeah.
and various things like that.
Hmm.
What do you think on those?
I find them very interesting, and that's a good point. So I've been working with this guy who I think I mentioned the Bowhunter earlier. There's a multitude of reasons why I like his case so much. I had to beg him for about 6 months to take me to where he saw this creature. He didn't because he was afraid I was going to release his name, put it on social media, do all this stuff, like try to, get attention through his case. And I had to convince him for like 6 months to take me out there. I'm like, look, I will not tell anyone all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. But he took me out there. And when he took me out there, first off, he had two guns on him, which was kind of unnerving for me. But he was definitely scared. He did not want to be out there. We went like in the morning when it was like daylight, and what he did show me though was a ton of structures. That was another thing that kind of compelled me, where like I looked at these things, I'm like, how in the heck would you get a crisscross log all the way up in that oak tree? You would have to have like wires, pulleys, or in a bunch of people helping you. And if he did that, was he doing that all for me just to trick one person? So I find that hard to believe that the guy is going to spend his time and money just to trick little old me, you know? So I don't think I'm that important. So I don't think I find like these sick treasures very compelling. I don't know what they mean, but they were appearing where this guy had a dramatic Bigfoot encounter. So I mean, like, yeah, I don't know what they represent. I don't know if it's necessarily the Bigfoot entity or creature doing it, but yes, you do find these structures around where people, have these Bigfoot experiences. And on the Omaha Indian Reservation, where they are still having, you know, obviously I can't verify it, but the reports are coming out that they see Bigfoot all the time, like all the time. And they have a ton of structures around there as well. So yeah, it does seem like it's one of those details that where you find Bigfoot, you find these odd looking structures and like lean-tos and collection of logs. And with that kind of stuff, I mean, sure, people could be like making a fort or trying to trick people or just like do some forest art. But some of these things, I'm like, they'd have to put a lot of time and work and have some manpower behind it to achieve these structures. So yeah, I find them very odd, compelling, and I think it is something we should pay attention to.
What about vocals? Have people heard anything that's strange or different?
Yeah, yeah, definitely in Nebraska. I mean, like especially around the Omaha Indian Reservation and the Winnebago Indian Reservation, where they have a lot of these reports still to this day. I mean, like currently, and the vocalizations are talked about, and I mean, I have not heard anything myself, but yeah, no, people do discuss the kind of like loud shrieks and high pitched like guttural sounds that sound like a bird, but they couldn't be a bird because the bird couldn't be that loud. So yeah, you do hear about the a lot of the same details and kind of symptoms of Bigfoot that you hear about in other states, we definitely get here as well.
Have you heard the Sierra sounds by chance?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Ron Moorhead's, yeah.
Yeah, what do you think of
Mhm.
those?
Oh, I love it. I love it. I mean, it's amazing, like it's like again, like I feel like Ron Moorhead has nothing to gain by making all this stuff up, really, like so. I mean, like I find them to be super compelling. I mean, like it's very weird. Those sounds are so odd, and it sounds like some kind of language. Yeah, no, I mean, I love it. I've listened to them 1,000 times. At one point, I had them on my phone just so I could reference them easy. But yeah, no, I mean, I love Ron Moorhead's work. I think he's great. I think he's one of the luminaries in the Bigfoot field, and is actually one of those guys too, which I like about. He's very open-minded. He is open-minded to the idea that it's flesh and blood, but he's also open-minded to the idea that Bigfoot represents something far more complex than just an animal we haven't discovered. So I like researchers like that because I would find when in the UFO world, in the Bigfoot world, in the paranormal world, when someone tells you they know exactly what this stuff is, I stop paying attention to them because I'm like, you don't know that. There's just no way. That is your guess. That is maybe what your belief system is telling you to lean towards. But nobody knows what this stuff is. And if they tell you they do, they're lying, I think. So I think just to have an open mind with all this stuff and also I look at it as just it's a wonderful way to adventure. Like if I wasn't into this stuff, I would never be going into rural Nebraska and having these wonderful walks through the forest and going through cornfields and going to small diners, talking to people, having a patty melt. Like it's just a really fun way to involve mystery and enchantment into your life. And so I find it to be just a great hobby that is like really healthy and positive. But I will always remain skeptical and radically open-minded, and I just want to hear people's stories because I feel like people's stories are what's important to me. Like there was a great German author back in the early 20th century, and she said, "The world is not made up of atoms; it's made up of stories." And I think about that a lot. So while people's like, "Oh, it's just some story from some Yahoo out in the sticks," I'm like, well, yeah, that's what's important to me is the story from the Yahoo out in the sticks, like, so I feel like I can't stress enough to where like I feel like collecting stories, talking to witnesses is really important. And I also, and that's not to diminish the people who are out there doing the boots in the groundwork. I think that is great and super important too. But so far, it really has yielded very little other than some recordings of odd sounds, which are great, and some footprints, and even some like, witness testimony where they'll see stuff out there. But it's not really gathering. I don't think where some people are like, well, you don't do boots in the ground research, la la la. And I'm like, sure, but I think collecting the stories is just as important, and talking to witnesses is actually the most important thing in my eyes.
What about the orbs? A lot of people see orbs around
Mm-hmm.
Bigfoot. Even
Mm-hmm.
I've even heard some people say that an orb turns into Bigfoot, Bigfoot turns
Mm-hmm.
into an orb. What are your thoughts on orbs?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, here in Nebraska, the Bowhunter case, he on his trail cam, he has trail cam footage, and guess what? He picks up a lot of orbs. And I'm not talking about like little dust particles. I'm talking about like bright orange objects that maybe could be a camera artifact or some kind of glitch, but like he's got kind of a lot of them. And then I do hear up on the Omaha Indian Reservation, they have orbs all the time, like, in conjunction with seeing Bigfoot. And I find that to be a hard thing to ignore. Now, what it is or what it represents, it would just be a total wild guess. And what I would say to you now could change tomorrow. But like, I really don't know. Like the idea of like orb turns into Bigfoot. Sure. I mean, like that's a fine guess, but I don't think we know that for sure. Like all we know is that people for a long time, when they have a Bigfoot experience, often before or after or during, experience orb phenomenon. And that, and a lot of people experience orb phenomenon without seeing a Bigfoot in a forest. Sometimes I kind of think about this orb light phenomenon almost as the raw form of all high strangeness, because people see orbs in houses. But when it, like, kind of like what I was saying earlier, when it's in an enclosed structure, people associate it with the ghost or poltergeist phenomenon. If they see it in the forest, they kind of think of it as, associated with Bigfoot or the Fae or some other kind of cryptid. But if they see it in the sky, they associate with UFOs. So orbs of light is a pattern that is almost roundly seen with all Forteana or high strangeness. And I think that is really important to think about, and how we kind of couch it in different definitions by where we are geographically, like being in a house or being in a forest or seeing in the sky. So I actually think orbs of light, while it's kind of the most, in a way, it's kind of mundane and a little, I don't find it to be boring, but I'm sure it's not as, sexy as a flying saucer thing of Bigfoot. But I think maybe the orbs of light could be the most important thing in a weird way, because it does seem like they show up time and time again throughout history in association with all this odd stuff.
Exactly. So, what's the strangest thing that has ever happened to you?
Oh boy, I would like to give you some great paranormal or ufological story, but I feel like I'm paranormal kryptonite. I will go on people who do have experienced things and go to areas that are, known for being, very active places, and it just turns off when I go out there. So like, I mean, the weirdest thing that has ever happened to me would probably just be something mundane, like, like, instead of French fries at Burger King, they accidentally gave me onion rings. Unfortunately, my life is in terms has not been as weird as I want it to be. But I'm holding out hope, Linda.
Aren't we all?
Yeah.
Uh, well, you did
It,
have that thing about, you happened to be going to Blair or wherever it was,
right.
and you had a story. So there's some synchronicity happening there.
Oh yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because when I find, and I don't know if you're this way, but when I'm in the zone really researching this stuff hard, like maybe I have some time off from work, or I'm hot on a case or hot on an idea, I do tend to have synchronicities a lot. And maybe it's because I'm like hyper aware and I'm kind of primed to have them because I'm looking into this weird stuff. But I can't deny, like you said, I have never been to Blair, Nebraska in my life. And I just happened to be going the next, like right through there the next morning. And there just happened to be right before I went to bed. Right before I went to bed, discovered that there was a fresh Bigfoot case. And even when I went out with my research partner, he was like, whoa, that's a crazy synchronicity. I'm like, yeah, it kind of is, man. So yeah, see, I definitely have experienced a lot of synchronicities, and it does tend to go into hyperdrive when I'm kind of doing a little bit of field research or writing about it or just like looking into a new case. Yeah. So something about this phenomenon I do think is a synchronicity generator of some sorts.
Have you had other synchronistic times like that at
Yeah,
all?
totally tons. It's hard for me to like pick out like gosh to think about like ones that would like be compelling to your audience because a lot of times with synchronicities they're like I think very personal and they're kind
Mhm.
of like dreams when you tell somebody like whoa I had this crazy dream about this people are like kind of young cool and but like when you have a synchronicity because you know all the factors the timing you were thinking about this and then this popped up it is one of these things where I feel like the power of the synchronicity is really only felt by the person having it. Now, other like you actually were able to pick out the synchronicity of me going to Blair. There are some that are just kind of like on the face odd coincidences, but I do think most time I've had synchronicities, I don't even bother telling people because I'm like, well, I'd have to like do a bunch of backstory to tell them why this is weird at this very moment. So, but that's okay. I think a lot of like I do wonder, and this is not my idea. There is a wonderful UFO high strange researcher who I is kind of is my mentor in a way named Greg Bishop, and he has always been toying around with this hypothesis that we co-create a lot of what we see and experience through the sea of archetypes that we all live in and whatever this phenomenon. I mean, in Jacques Vallée, and John Keel and some of these luminaries in the UFO field have hinted at the same thing that it's not necessarily all external and that it's part us who are generating the actual object that we're seeing. And I find that to be interesting. Like, and when they say these things, they're not saying this is how it is. They're saying, no, it just kind of seems that way. So I that is something I'm always thinking about, like, and I do think there's something to it because I mean, like, if there was if this all these phenomena were simply all external and had nothing to do with us, why is it always changing? And why do people report like thousands of different looking entities coming off a UFO? It's just there's not a lot of consistency with what people experience until like the 1980s when everyone was saying like gray aliens. But now, I mean, how often do you hear about gray alien experiences nowadays? It's like it seems like UFOs are based on trends of like what people experience. It's more trend based than it is like different things constantly coming into our atmosphere and showing itself to us. I just the extraterrestrial hypothesis too is just kind of one of those like it's such a stretch. I don't think there's much to the ETH. I do think I am the first to tell you I think there is something absolutely genuine about the UFO phenomenon, but I just think kind of like the flesh and blood Bigfoot that the ETH nuts and bolts UFO is to me a little bit of a simplistic way, too simplistic. I think it's much more complex and much weirder and again, probably has something more to do with the nature of reality than it does aliens from another planet visiting us.
Well, I can understand that and appreciate it. And as far as that co-creation, I think we probably are in so many ways part of that dynamic,
Mm-hmm.
as to what we experience, but we don't know exactly how that works totally.
Absolutely.
And how much of it is within perhaps our own ability to understand.
Right.
So you started out by saying you're an actor and
Mm-hmm.
you're a comedian. Have you put
Mm-hmm.
together any routines involving Bigfoot?
It's funny. I had, about 2 years ago, I lived in LA for 21 years, and about 2 years ago, I moved back to Nebraska, just because my parents are getting a little bit older and I want to be close to them. And so I have started to speak about like do at conferences like kind of in the Midwest about I'll do like a weird Nebraska lecture. But I kind of stopped doing more of like an academic PowerPoint presentation because that's just, I feel like that's not what people want from me. So I kind of a little bit do more of a walking around talking about these cases, but I try to do it in a lighter comedic way where people get a laugh at it a little bit. And I'm actually doing I have a couple stand-up shows booked, which I haven't done stand-up for a long time, but I'm starting to dip my toe back into it. But a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, my stand-up routine at comedy clubs, and these are audiences that are not necessarily UFO or Bigfoot fans. I am talking about this stuff more because I am okay at laughing at the fact that I'm a 47-year-old man looking for Bigfoot in a cornfield with a perfect stranger who's carrying two guns. There's something when you about that when you zoom out that is very funny to me. Like so and I'm not making fun at all of Bigfoot or UFOs. I have for 40 years of my life been reading constantly. I'm very serious about this stuff. I have a podcast, and I just like this stuff is really important to me. So I'm never making fun of it. I'm more making fun of myself in my pursuit because I find my pursuit of knowledge of this stuff comedic a little bit as well.
Well, sometimes we find the most humor in things even that are a little bit scary, the things that
Yes.
we don't know, the things that we don't understand. We can find a lot of humor in that occasionally. Yeah.
I totally agree with you. And also like I feel like keeping it light sometimes and not always like gravely serious. That's a lot of the people who are like disclosure activists, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm like, God bless, do what you gotta do. But sometimes I find the seriousness level of these disclosure activists to be pretty funny, where I'm like, y'all are putting a lot of time and effort on trying to like force a government that's never going to tell you the truth about this stuff to tell you the truth about this stuff. And also, like, I guess with activism in general, it's like, hey, man, this earth and this country, we got a lot of problems. And so I feel like maybe if you're going to do activism, there might be better ways to spend your time than trying to convince the government to tell you what UFOs represent. Because my guess, I have a guess that I would think, sure, the government has more data, a lot more information, and a lot more cases than we'll ever be able to gather. But at the end of the day, I am not convinced for a second that the government or these defense companies or the greatest minds in the world have any better idea what this stuff is than you or I, Linda. I really believe that. Like, I think a lot of people like they want an answer so bad, and so they've kind of assigned that the U.S. government knows all the answers. If we can break down the walls of Area 51, we'll know all the truths of the world. And I think that's the greatest like power play for the government to ever happen. It's like, yep, we know everything, but we're not going to tell you. So it's almost just like a better way to control us by them kind of and like look, we all know if you're a student of ufology, like the government has been putting tons of disinformation going back to the early 80s about UFOs. A lot of the big UFO narratives that I knew and loved growing up, I found out were false and wrong and incorrect and were just fake stories put out there to the UFO community to confuse people. So I think it's one of these things where sometimes you have to look inward and say like, oh, a lot of these like stories I loved about UFOs and this researcher or this witness, you have to look inward and say like, oh, I was wrong. That is not true. And yet I'm going to still move forward. So, and that's been kind of one of the bitter pills I had to, I would have to tell my little kid self who believed every UFO story and every narrative about all this stuff. Now I've kind of realized, well, I'm like, look, there's no evidence for it. And this person turned out to be a disinformation agent like Rick Doty or something like that. I'm like, I feel like we have to be able to like be honest with ourselves and say like, look, a lot of this stuff I think is genuine, but a lot of it I think is not. So, you just have to be able to sift through it. And that's one of those things with UFOs. I really do feel like it is important to at least understand the history from 1947 to the present day. Because if you're just jumping into UFOs and you're starting with the Tic Tac case and, you're missing a whole lot of history. And that's another thing that I guess, kind of bugs me about disclosure, the disclosure movement and all that stuff. It's like they're just talking about the modern phenomenon. They're forgetting all the history and all the wonderful work these researchers did compiling in books that really tells a lot of the story of UFOs of the 20th century. And I feel like if you're going to become a student of ufology, you really need to understand the fake cases, the genuine cases, how it's changed, like who is this researcher working for? I really feel it does require a lot of work to really understand the UFO narrative.
Well, and it is a broad one.
Oh yeah, you said it. It really is. I mean, like like I know we don't know each other well, but you were saying you've been studying the UFO phenomenon for quite a while, and as you know, I mean, like there are stories and cases that you're like, whoa, and for a long time you're like, this is so amazing, this is a great case, but then you find out like, Well, one of the witnesses later comes out, it's like, actually, that didn't happen. And you have to be willing to take in new information and change your mind about things. So I feel like if you're always playing your, flag in the sand, it's like, this case is genuine no matter what new information I hear, well, I'm like, then you're not really being honest with yourself. And I feel like I think there are a lot of people in UFOs and Bigfoot who are definitely honest with themselves when they hear new information and go, oh, okay, well, I love that case. Like if we found out, like, I think I love the Patterson Gimlin film, like everyone else. It's wonderful. And I don't think it was faked. I think I mean, like, if I had to bet, I think it's genuine. I really do. I'm kind of in the camp of they caught something. But if I found out tomorrow that 100% fact that it was a man in the suit, like a special effects department in Hollywood did this big hoax, if I found that out and I knew for certain that it was true, well, then I would drop that case and say, like, hey, well, we all got taken for a ride for 60, 70 years, moving on, and I wouldn't think twice about it. So I feel like that is the attitude you kind of have to have in these fields where it's like, you got to be willing to let go of some of these cases or narratives or stories that you loved for a long time if you find out new information that they are potentially not genuine. So I'm willing to drop everything, and just I want to learn. I want to evolve. Like I want, at the end of my life, however long I get to live, I hope I have like 1,000 different ideas of what UFOs or Bigfoot is. Like I want to be guessing at to the end because the mystery to me is what's important. And like I was saying, I just do not think we'll ever know what this stuff is. And maybe it's supposed to be like that.
I
Maybe it's
agree.
supposed to be a mystery.
And the mystery is what keeps us going. So tell me
Amen.
what is the name of your podcast?
It's called High Strangeness, and that's HI, comma, strangeness, like I'm saying hello to strangeness. And yeah, I have a lot of researchers in, I'm kind of an all-purpose weirdo, and I say that with a lot of love. But yeah, I'm interested in, UFOs, obviously, and all the stuff that goes in with UFOs, even the characters in ufology. We talk about cryptids, Bigfoot, all Bigfoot researchers on people who are interested in the ghost world or the paranormal or palmistry or, spontaneous human combustion. I feel like all these kinds of weird Fortean topics are all in this kind of like booyah-based soup, and that we just need to pull out like different bites every once in a while and try them out and talk about them and see how they compare, see how they contrast. And yeah, so my podcast it's really just a panoply of weirdness. And I've been fortunate to have some really good guests on and people I've looked up to for a long time. Really, the podcast, and I'm sure it's kind of been the same way for you, where it's just an excuse to talk to people I want to talk to and ask questions. And it's really been, I just love it so much. It's like, and it's one of these things where I don't make any money doing it. I just lose money doing it, but it's really important to me. And it's just been this great entree for me to be able to ask great questions to people I really admire. So yeah, it's a lot of fun for me.